The first scholar we're going to look at when it comes to dealing with Old Testament violence is John Goldingay. He has this 3-volume series on Old Testament theology. In the first volume, he deals with the topic of these verses that seem to suggest genocide in the Old Testament. And this is how he deals with them. First of all, he offers a disclaimer, which is that Israel is unique in world history as God's chosen people. Therefore, no other nation can rightly justify their own genocidal acts by claiming to be imitating Israel, because Israel was one people chosen by God for a specific person, and so they're unique in that way. So Goldingay makes that distinction. But when he looks at the different types of war that Israel wages in the Bible, and when God commands them to wage war, he's able to see five different categories that we see in the Old Testament. So he's able to nuance this, what oftentimes is seen as a very violent Old Testament God, and say, slow down. First of all, let's look at the categories of war in the Old Testament. First of all, you have liberative war, which is, one example would be when Abraham rescues Lot by force in the book of Genesis. So you have Abraham who goes and takes up arms in order to liberate somebody else. Number 2 is passive warfare. An example of this would be the Exodus story, where Israel is actually leaving war making to God. They're not picking up arms themselves. They're achieving liberty or freedom by leaving it and putting it in God's hand, who does the fighting for them. Number 3 is defensive. Israel will respond when attacked, and we see this several times throughout Israel's story in the Old Testament. So defensive. Number 4 is punitive. Yahweh actually punishes other nations, but he uses human agents to do so. There are times even when God will use Nebuchadnezzar as his weapon, as his tool to bring judgment upon Israel. At other times earlier in the story, Israel is seen as being God's agent of exercising God's judgment upon other nations for their wickedness. So punitive, that's number 4. And number 5 is pacifist. Israel is told not to fight at all. There are moments in the story where they're told not to attack Edom or Moab or Ammon. And even the Old Testament itself points towards a future, a hope, where weapons of war will actually be melted down and turned into farming tools. And so it pictures this coming day in the future where war will be no more. And that seems to be the ideal, argues Goldingay, is a world without war. And so that's the 5th option, which is the pacifist option, which is really no war making whatsoever. Goldingay also deals with an important concept, and that is this term in Hebrew, herem. Herem we see in a couple of the passages that we shared in the previous video. Let me read one of them. It's in Deuteronomy 20, 16 and 17. It says, "But in the cities, these peoples that the Lord your God is going to give you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction." And that term for to devote them to complete destruction is the Hebrew word herem. And this word, and this will be something that we talk about in the upcoming videos, can also be translated as set apart as an offering to the Lord. It's a word that is used in a lot of cultic connotations. In other words, sacrificial connotations. And so Goldingay argues that this word herem was actually more of a theological principle than it was a command of just always annihilation. The larger point is to keep Israel separate from the nation so that they can keep and retain their identity as worshipers of Yahweh. And so this term herem, while we read it as most of our translations as to devote to complete destruction, there is a different connotation in the original language, so argues John Goldingay. And as part of this, the Rahab story is actually evidence of this, where you have Rahab, who is a Gentile, part of the people of the city of Jericho, and she, in a sense, shows that herem is a flexible concept because God doesn't want everybody dead. Rahab herself actually becomes part of the lineage of Jesus. She's part of these people that were supposed to be devoted to destruction, or herem, offered to God, whatever that might mean. And we're seeing in the Rahab story, Goldingay argues, that herem is a flexible concept, that it's not as if there's this angry God that wants to devote everybody to destruction. And so Goldingay has a few ways then of dealing with Old Testament violence. First of all is let's categorize that violence, because not every war is created equal. And so he's able to give us those 5 different categories, and then he enters into that discussion of that Hebrew word herem, which more scholars that we will look at in the coming videos are also going to deal with that word to give us a greater nuance for what's happening with Old Testament violence, and then reconciling it with the Jesus in the New Testament that tells us to love our enemies. So overall, Goldingay does a good job of contextualizing what's happening in the story of the Bible with Israel. God is keeping them separate, and he keeps them separate for a reason and for a purpose. Is because the promise to Abraham and his family was that they were going to be a blessing to all the nations. But first they needed to be distinct from the nations. And so herem becomes a very important part of that overall story. And that is something that Goldingay does very well in explaining and trying to deal with this Old Testament violence.